While retirement, has some positive and negative associations with it, and yes, there are individual differences in how those come down. The next transition that we're going to be talking about, widowhood, is, I'm not going to say universally negatively experienced, but obviously there are more negative associations with losing your spouse. So, according to some operational definitions, a widow or widower is somebody who has lost their spouse but has not remarried. And so, I was talking to my husband about this idea. Like if somebody lost the spouse but then got remarried, did they not still lose that spouse? So it just depends on how you're operationally defining this. When we look at some data, about a third of individuals over the age of 56 are widowed. And again, so using this definition, that this means that they're not remarried. So they've lost a spouse and they're not remarried. I don't need you to remember that specific percentage because it's going to vary from sample to sample. When we think about this time period of widowhood, or this transition, I should say, you have to be thinking about what actually happened. This person who lost a spouse lost a person who, in most cases, was the closest to them. So it was their companion, a person that they're usually seeing the most, their support person, whether that's financial support, emotional support, both, physical support. They might have lost their status. So this is complicated in terms of losing your status. What does that mean? But it could mean many different things. So for example, if you were known as part of a couple and you're no longer that couple, then let's say there are times where couple friends get together to play cards or to have dinners. Well, you might not be invited anymore just because you don't have that status anymore. That's just one example. It also could affect income, and not necessarily that might be the most important factor when you're thinking about losing, what it would be like to lose a spouse, but it definitely does play into our lives, right? If our needs are met financially, that's really important in terms of our overall stress level and overall health. Just like I was talking about with retirement, this is also a potential to lead to an identity crisis because for some individuals, a spouse or significant other represents like a part of them. Or you see your role as wife or husband, and like that's a huge part of your identity. So if you lose that significant other and no longer are a wife or a husband because that person is no longer living, then this can be particularly challenging, particularly hard, because that's just who you are. I think about my mother-in-law. My father-in-law died when he was only 52 years old, and this was about 13 years ago or so. And when he died unexpectedly, my mother-in-law was a stay-at-home mom. Like she was a homemaker. She was a person who prepared dinner for her children, and then when her children were out of the home, for her husband. And so for her, a big part of her identity was really lost when she lost her husband. And that's just again one example. But for some of us, our identities are really wrapped up in our romantic relationships, not entirely, but representing at least a big part of who we are. There have been multiple studies of life stress, but in this particular study of life stress, and just looking at over the lifespan, report on these stressors that you've had in your life, and describe how traumatic these stressors actually were. What they found is that the death of one's spouse was reported as the most traumatic. And obviously people lose spouses at different ages, and so like that's going to not just be, basically this question doesn't have to be just asked of people who are in their 70s or 80s. But I know that you're young. I'm young, but losing partner after 50 to 60 years of marriage, or 40 years, or 30 years, and just imagine that. What that would be like, what that would feel like, what that would look like. And so hopefully when you're imagining this, you can see how it would be really traumatic. Not that I want you to dwell on this in a negative light, but to just better understand this transition. What research suggests, after widowhood is that we don't just get better after losing a significant other. This is going to apply to loved ones broadly and not just significant others, but we don't just get better. Essentially, after a period of time, and we'll be talking about death and dying in our last lecture, but we emerge as just different people, hopefully more resilient. We might have gone through an identity change after losing a significant other, but again, it's not better, it's different. For most, after widowhood or becoming a widow, they report increased depression, other internalizing problems like anxiety and just stress. It doesn't necessarily have to meet the threshold for these different diagnoses, but the symptoms can still be present. We also know that it affects cognition, so just our processing speed, our memory, working memory, and attention. So like it really is a whole body experience by losing somebody who is close to you. There are some interesting findings associated with becoming a widow or widower. One of those is the widowhood effect, and you may have heard of this before, even if it didn't have a name. And this is the idea that it's actually measurable. We can actually have seen this in research studies, but an increased likelihood for a recently widowed person to die. So essentially, like if you lose your significant other, more likely to die sooner than later. I've seen this actually with one of my friends, like grandparents, like grandparent one, I can't remember if it was grandma or grandpa, died, and then the other grandparent, even though they weren't even sick, just died like 2 months later. So they didn't live very long without each other. You may have seen stories of people who, were elderly and who died holding hands in the hospital. And so why does this happen? I think it's complicated, but it does show that there is an interesting association between our overall health and our social relationships. Our social relationships are buffers. They're protective factors. So if you lose those social relationships, how does that ultimately affect your health? Speaking of some of those social relationships, we do see a gender difference. Men tend to show worse health problems after losing a spouse. And it's not necessarily every single male, but this is related to both mortality rates, so just health and dying overall, but also cognitive problems like dementia. So why does this happen? Again, just this interesting relationship between health and our social relationships. Just like any other transition in life, I think about divorce here, for example, or having children who move out of the home or becoming a parent. All of these life transitions, there are certain people who fare better than others. So certain people who go through the experience and are more resilient or have more optimal outcomes, not necessarily right after the transition, but over time. And so here, I'm presenting a few points about what the research says about who fares best, like who does the best after losing a really important person in their life. So one of the pieces of evidence shows that death circumstances matter. So for example, for individuals who have had a spouse who was suffering for a long period of time, or had a terminal illness that they were aware that one day, maybe pretty soon, that they were going to pass away, those individuals tend to fare a little bit better than those who lose a spouse suddenly. And this could be for a number of reasons. One, to like that person was suffering. It could also mean like that you were caregiving for them, and even though you wouldn't do it any other way, that's also stressful. Age also plays a role. So individuals, even though I said imagine, losing a spouse after 50, 60 years on the last slide, research shows that losing a spouse while younger is actually harder. than losing a spouse when one is older. I mean, lots of individual differences here, of course. But, you know, like this is I think one of the reasons here is because you were anticipating this whole life together and weren't able to achieve that. I have a friend from junior high who has 3 little ones, and she lost her husband in an accident, a boating accident a few years ago, and she always writes about this on social media, and it's still, you know, obviously affecting her today. But it was a sudden loss, first of all, but also, you know, left her with these 3 little ones. I don't think her experience in terms of how she is negotiating that, and not to say she's not doing well, she is, you know, in the circumstances is definitely doing well now, but, you know, it's definitely a challenge. Personality also plays a role. So for individuals who are more outgoing or extroverted, this is going to be a situation where they might be able to go and make social connections to kind of not necessarily make up for the lost social connection, but, you know, establish new ones. Those who are higher in self-esteem, this is overall like just a positive evaluation associated with lots of good outcomes. People who think they can do it, so live life without that significant other, so self-efficacy. And then people who are more resilient overall. Now, most people are fairly resilient, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a personality trait. Resilience can be practiced and learned, but for some individuals, able to kind of grit their teeth and bear it and get through hard times more than other people. Just in general, some people are more affected by the environment than others. We often talked about religion and how that could help individuals through difficult times. And so for individuals who are more active in their faith, so attending services more frequently, tend to do better. But I will say that those who are more spiritually connected or more spiritual do grieve maybe less intensely, but doesn't mean that this is a total protective factor against these internalizing symptoms. So it's not to say that they're less depressed. It's just a situation where you could still feel the emotions, but you might be processing them in different ways. And last but not least, those who have a good support network are going to do better. But I will qualify that a little bit. So early on in the process of losing someone, early on in mourning, you know, it's typically the case that we see friends and family, including children, rally around the person who, you know, lost their partner. And families are grieving together and they're sharing memories together. And so this can be a real sense of support and an uplifting experience. The problem is, though, that for a lot of families, this is pretty temporary. And then let's say children or family and friends go back to their, you know, normal lives. And so for individuals who really do fare the best are the ones where where their children or family or friends might not be around as much as they were right in the beginning, but continue to remain around and to continue play a role in their social network. So if children and family and friends are just hanging around for, you know, the just days and weeks following a death, and then they leave, then this isn't going to lead to the best optimal outcomes. Just to leave this slide and leave this presentation on this picture right here is a picture of my grandpa who passed away in 2012, but I just like this picture because I was really close to him, and I know that my grandma struggles with having him in her life. And that is a picture of my cousin. She's young enough to be my niece, but she's actually my cousin. So the next lecture we have coming up is going to be about health issues in basically later adulthood. So we'll talk to you then.